Hi, I'm 𝗕𝗶𝗹𝗴𝗶, and for the last 30 years I've been writing about Belgium and its amazing beer culture. I've written a book called 𝗕𝗶𝘀𝗵 Belgium, done 8 editions, covers all the beer bars, all the breweries, all the beer brands, all the beer stores, all the beer festivals, and just about anything else beery in Belgium. To put this in perspective, in 2016, UNESCO put Belgian beer culture on its list of the intangible cultural assets of humanity, which is a very fancy way of saying that officially Belgian beer is one of the best things on the planet. So CAMRA's asked me to put together a short film explaining how Belgian beer is different from British, American, and other types of beer. To do that, what we've done is come to Antwerp, and the golden rule about trying to understand any type of beer is that there are no golden rules, there are only tendencies. So Belgian beers tend to be bottled when they're best, but then some of them are on draft. The bottles tend to be ales, but then fewer lagers, and there's also a type of beer called lambic that's almost unique to Belgium. The bottled beers tend to be re-fermented in the bottle. There's live yeast in those beers, helping them to develop over months. The Belgian beers tend to be stronger than others, though they've got some pretty good session beers. And as just about anywhere else, the best ones tend to come from independent brewers. So to try to do the story of Belgian beer in a couple of minutes, which is near impossible, we've come to Antwerp and we've enlisted the help of 𝗕𝗶𝗹𝗵𝗶, which is a specialist beer cafe and a beer store, and of its owner, 𝗕𝗶𝗀𝗵𝗏𝗏, who'll be helping us taste our way through 8 different beers and a couple of beer snacks. So we're going to start with a distinctly English-speaking style of beer, which is a light stout, 𝗕𝗶𝗃 from 𝗓𝗏𝗏 in Brussels, done in the Belgian way. First, note the glass. This brewery prefers glasses that will bring out a generous head in the beer and will also force the aroma off the top, and that's mostly roasted barley, roasted malt. The beer is made slightly differently. They mash it at a lower temperature, they use 100% malted barley, they don't speed up any of the processes, and they use very shallow fermenting vessels. And all of that comes together to mean that you don't get the kind of reediness of a dry Irish stout, but you get a fuller bodied beer. The flavor of which is much more rounded, and it's really quite astonishing that that's just 4.5% alcohol. So it's a standard international type of beer, but made with Belgian aplomb. 𝗕𝗶𝗃𝗵. All right. Okay. So we'll stay broadly within the comfort zone for the second beer, which is XX bitter, or XX bitter in English. This is a bitter beer from De Ranker in Dottigny, who are a brewery that is credited with re-establishing hoppy beers in Belgium, and in fact helping the whole Belgian hop industry to revive in the process. It is a bitter, however, most British bitters are not actually bitter, they're mainly malt driven, and they're usually quite light. This is 6% alcohol, and note the name. XX comes from a very ancient system of classifying beers. In the old days, if it was a sampling strength beer, it'd get 2 X's. If it was a session strength beer, it'd get 1 X. If it was a sipping strength beer, it'd be 3 X's. And as for bitter, well, that's the Flemish Dutch word for bitter. And that beer is bitter. It's very hoppy. It's not just got a massive hop aroma. It comes through as having a degree of hop bitterness, but also major hop flavors. And here we have the first example of another wonderful Belgian habit, which is to get designer nibbles. This is a salami called 𝗕𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗏. It is made 20 miles up the way in 𝗕𝗶𝗹𝗹, and it's a fatty salami, which means that it tends to, the bitterness cuts through the fat cuts through the bitterness. It's a very good match, I'm told. Oh yeah. Yeah, that works. That's really good. I don't quite know what more to say about that. Okay. Thank you. Right. Great. Now, we're just going to start nudging into Belgian territory here. But where to start with this beer? First up, it's a wheat beer. Go back 1,000 years, there was brown beers made from barley, white beers made from wheat, called white because they go hazy with flour in the body of the beer. In Germany, they're spicy like with nutmeg, clove, banana, from what the yeast does to the beer. In Belgium, things are added. And historically, the type of Belgian beer, or wit beer, would have coriander and dried orange peel, stuff like that in it. This is made by a local brewery. They've actually commissioned it from a slightly larger brewery, but in Antwerp. And it is made with chamomile and citra hops. But it reaches the same point, which is a kind of spicy citrus aroma, following through to a sweet, bready taste, a little bit like, imagine making sourdough bread with a cake mix. And this is served with a type of salami that is different. It's called secreto. And I hope my mother isn't watching from up there because she said never stick a knife in your mouth. Softer flavor, but again matches the spiciness of the wheat beer in a way that really goes together well. I'm starting to enjoy this. Right, now beer number 3, we're going to go deep into proper Belgian territory. Okay. Well, yeah, this is a Dr. Beer take on how to serve an old 𝗓𝗏. This is an American-style 1920 champagne glass, and 𝗓𝗏 is known as the champagne of beers for good reasons. Trying to explain 𝗓𝗏 in a minute can't be done, but let's have a go. You take a wheat beer, instead of brewing it with proper hops, you brew it with old hops. So you can stack it full of hops, but there's no bitterness, there's no aroma, there's no hop flavors, there's just the preservation qualities. That's fine. You then take the beer, you cool it overnight in the brewery, cold night air blows over it, morning you shove it into a oak cask and it stays there for anything up to 3 years. At that point, you've got what's called a lambic. No added yeast. The yeast comes from the night sky. To make a 𝗓𝗏, you take a 2-3-year-old lambic, small amount, young lambic, been there 6 to 12 months in the barrel, and you put the two together, add a drop of liquid sugar, shove it in a champagne-type bottle, and leave it for several months. And then, what you get, what you get is a drink that you shouldn't start trying to understand from believing it's a beer. Imagine it's a vintage cider. Imagine that it's a sparkling wine. It just happens to be made out of grain. And you get something that is lively, effervescent. The aroma is slightly citrus, and the flavor is a mix of citrus that comes from the acidification in year 1, year 2, and of slow-acting yeast that add a certain mustiness to it, and an aroma of hay barns and old bookshops. It's one of the most extraordinary drinks in the world. Bone Old 𝗓𝗏 is probably the most available. You can get some of that in the UK, certainly get it in the US. And yeah, it's a beer that has never ceased to amaze me why it exists. But it's beautiful. Okay. So for our fifth beer, we're going to head a little bit further south into the Wallonian part of Belgium to try a saison. This is an old-fashioned beer style from a very new brewery, actually in Brussels. Saison derives itself from, oh, thank you. Okay. Saison derives from the time when there used to be farm breweries that were essentially farms that grew grain, but then worked as a brewery in the winter. So the agricultural workers that finished after harvest would then go and work in the brewery over winter, and then they'd give up the brewing in the spring because you don't want open fermenters at a time when you've got hot weather and loads of insect life around. It also developed a type of beer which had to be made in the spring to carry on supplying beer through the summer at low strength for the agricultural workforce, and also to make stronger beers around the time of harvest that would then sort of tide them over until they started brewing again in the autumn. Now the characteristics, there's all sorts of traditions of Saison, but the key characteristics of it is it's got a rustic, earthy aroma that follows through into the flavor. Yeah. And that comes from the fact that because it was kept for a long time over summer, you got a mixed fermentation. You get the ale yeast and you also get some slower yeast. And it creates a unique character within what is normally a pale ale. This pairs with a cheese. This one's called 𝗕𝗶𝘀, and it actually comes from Limburg. And it's kind of in the brie style, in that it's a washed cheese. The name translates as pile of hay, because in the old days they used to develop this cheese actually on a small pile of straw. Interesting pairing. This is, and they share the rustic tendency, which, yeah, it's quite alluring. Yeah, I mean, the thing about it is that huge rustic aromas from this, quite a lot from this. Not a heavy cheese, because if it was, it would kind of ruin the beer. And likewise, this is a medium strength beer. So the pairing really works well. Okay, so for our sixth beer, I'm aware I've kind of taken you into really rather obscure places so far. So let's come back to something you might even have heard of. It's a beer called La Chouffe. It comes from the Ardennes, and it's made by a brewery based here in Antwerp, 𝗕𝗶𝘀𝗶𝘁, quite a large but still family-owned brewery. And it demonstrates something. If you ask a brewer in Belgium, an experienced brewer, what makes Belgian beer special, they will use the word balance, and balance needs a little bit of explaining. You see, if you get a British beer that's 8% alcohol by volume, you're really gonna feel the strength in it. It can be sticky, it can be alcoholic, it can be at least heavy. Whereas here in Belgium, you get a beer that's 8% alcohol, and you'd never guess. Quite dangerously so, actually. And the way they do it is you get a slightly less refined type of malt, you mash it at a slightly lower temperature, and about this strength, maybe 15% of the malt is substituted by simple sugar. And a combination of all of those makes it a much more approachable beer. And it also means that when you're adding in hops or other flavors, you don't have to try quite so hard to alter the flavor of the beer. This ends up, in a sense, it's a bit of a gateway beer. It's got a commercial edge to it, but it's quite nice to drink. It's got a lush flavor. And if you're starting to get into more general Belgian beers, it's one to start with. Any beer better than this is really good. This is more than acceptable. Okay, now we're going to move to a rather older tradition. Most people who don't know anything about Belgian beer will know one fact, which is that there are 5 Trappist monastery breweries in Belgium. And although there's not a typical Trappist style, or there's no Trappist style as such, the one that is most typical is a type called 𝗕𝗶𝗹𝗹, which was really created at the 𝗬𝗲𝗏 brewery. It reflects the type of beer you'll find all over Belgium, Netherlands, even into northern France. It's also reflected in the UK in the types of double brown beer that used to be popular in the north of England. And it's reflected abroad in doppio malto in Italy, and there's now a Spanish type as well. The aroma is chocolatey. The aroma is unmistakably a brown ale. And the flavor follows through on the same thing. And what I like about Trappist beers is that although they are sold commercially, they are in the beer market. And although unquestionably monastic beers sell well and get a good reputation because of a sort of type of sentimentality about it that falls over into good Christian values and all that kind of stuff, I have to say that there's something about the honesty of Trappist beers, straightforwardness of them. There's no flash, there's no adding bits of acid, adding bits of fruit and all the rest of it. It's just a straightforward down the line type of beer that tastes just good. And much as I'd love to hate them, actually I really like them. Okay. More nibbles, great. Excellent, thank you. So we're going to finish on a type of beer that really should have died out in the last 20 years. I'm delighted that it hasn't. Locally, it's known as Old Brown. So nobody in marketing would choose that name, but it's a type of beer. It's basically a brown ale. You brew it, you stick it in oak barrels, and you just let God do the rest. Most breweries make it in, that still make it. I say most, there's only really 2 or 3. Make it in quite large quantities. And at the end, they take the old beer that has matured, acidified a bit, etc., developed a fantastic tang, which is a mix of the caramel in the original beer and some lactic acid that develops during longer fermentation. Lactic acid is odorless, it is tasteless, but the caramel acid combination is pretty striking. Unbelievably, 1 or 2 small breweries have started making this type of beer small batch, and this is one of them. This is 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, set up by a couple of guys, I think when they were still at university. Now, probably got about 10 years experience under their belt. One of their first beers was Old Brown, and it is actually frankly acidic in the nose. I don't know how much fresh beer they mix with this, but maybe none, but it's strikingly acidic. But it follows through, not with an acidic tang so much as a very dry tartness. And because it's got the caramel there, somehow it survives. And this is a new one on me because I'm pairing this with a type of cheese called 𝗕𝗲𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 or 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. And it's kind of like, it's a familiar blue type cheese. And I was wondering how this would work because often blue cheeses are pretty acidic and they don't really match with slightly acidic beers. But here it's really edgy. It just about gets to that point where the lighter acidity in the cheese and the creaminess of the cheese is kind of balancing in the same way as the caramel and the lactic acid in the beer is balancing. And you feel like you're on the edge, but actually in terms of beer drinking generally, you know you're somewhere new where you haven't been before. And that, in a sense, is what Belgian beer is all about. So, what do I hope we've learned? Well, let's get this in proportion. I've just done 8 beers. Belgium produces 3,000 beers. I've done beers from 8 styles. There's probably over 100 different styles of beer in Belgium. We are in one very nice beer cafe, Dr. Beer in Antwerp. There are about 800 really specialist beer cafes around Belgium. We are here in Antwerp because our friends from Visit Flanders kindly paid for our trip to come here, which thank you very much. But actually, Belgium's got a whole load of interesting beer drinking cities and small towns and villages and country pubs. So actually what I'd say to you is that we've just dipped a toe in the water. It's now up to you to go out there and explore.